Okay, we good? All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome in this beautiful Monday morning to Concordia University's Fourth Space. Thank you for joining us for today's event, the next installment in the series, Evaluating Excellence, Academic Assessment, and the Open Science Transition. To help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from Fourth Space. We are located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. In the Fourth Space, we work with our university community, help mobilize knowledge through daily activities that examine research questions and projects happening across the university. And just real quick to help those of you joining us on Zoom, we're running this as a live stream meeting, so please feel free to add your comments or questions in the chat there, and we'll do our best to get them to everyone. And for those of you joining in the space, just let us know, raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you so everyone can hear. But with that, it's very much my pleasure to hand things over to Professor in Geography, Planning, and Environment, but also the Associate Vice President of Research and Development and Outreach, Monica Mulrennan. Monica, welcome back.
Thanks, Doug. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Before we get started, let us acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. We recognize and are grateful to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation for their care of these lands and waters, and for their teachings about the earth and our relations. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, has been a gathering place for many First Nations for millennia, and today is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. Recognizing and respecting the presence and ongoing connections of these historical and contemporary communities is an important step towards building trust and creating or renewing relationships. The focus of this speaker series on transforming academic assessment includes opportunities for us as treaty peoples to identify additional meaningful steps that we can take in this regard, such as actively seeking ways to honor Indigenous teachings and perspectives in our work, fostering meaningful research partnerships with Indigenous communities, and doing the work to educate ourselves and others about the rich cultural heritage of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation and other Indigenous nations. So welcome to the third event in the speaker series, Evaluating Excellence, Rethinking Academic Assessment. The series is a joint initiative of the OVPRGS and the Office of the Provost and Vice President Academic. It's supported by funding from an EDI stipend from the Canada Research Chairs Programme. I'd like to give special thanks to Holly Nazar from the Office of Research for her work in organising the speaker series, and also thank Loredana Carboni, Doug Moffat, and the Fourth Space team for making today's event happen. The series is a response to a growing international movement that's calling on us to really rethink academic assessment. So how we define success, who and what we value, and what informs our academic practices and culture. The series is also a more particular response to a recommendation that came forward from the working group on the impact of the pandemic on faculty and librarians, which called for measures to recognize and value the full range of activities of academic life. The series is also an opportunity for us to take up many of the themes identified during the 17 Rooms exercise led by Jason Enns last year as part of Concordia's commitment to the UN SDGs. The first series in the event, which happened mid-November, was a talk and a workshop given by Giovanna Lima from the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. And that was focused on building evidence-based impact narratives. The second event, a couple of weeks ago, was a super interesting presentation by Vincent Larivière from UDM on the challenges and concerns associated with bibliometric indicators that we all too often rely upon in academic assessment. Following today's exciting session, we have two more events, one addressing EDI and the last addressing transformations in relation to decolonization. So the intention of the Evaluating Excellence Speaker Series is to bring rich and informed perspectives and expertise to Concordia, offering opportunities for us to gain insights into the rapidly shifting landscape of assessment, and also to inform our thinking and reform processes. So I'm going to hand you over to Nico, Dr. Alessandroni, to kick off today's event. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Monica, Renan, also Holly, Nazar, and OBPRGS for inviting me to provide some opening remarks. It's really a pleasure. And I want to start by highlighting why this session is important to all, but specifically to Concordia, right? So as you know, worldwide governments and funding agencies are developing new mandates and policies to implement open science by the day. And in this context, one growing concern is how to align open science implementation with incentives and academic assessment more broadly. At Concordia, for instance, the Open Science Working Group has identified research assessment as a critical area requiring reform. So today, Dr. Kelly Cobey, a notable scientist and open science advocate, will help us bridge the concepts of open science and academic assessment and envision new ways of evaluating what researchers do, all in the context of Concordia's commitment to inclusive excellence. So as for the agenda, we will hear a 40-minute presentation by Dr. Kelly Cobey, followed by a 40-minute discussion and Q&A. And after that, there will be more opportunities for networking after the workshop. And now I'm going to introduce the host for today's event, Amy Buckland. Amy is our university librarian that joined Concordia on September 2023. She has led several open access and scholarly communication initiatives, and some of her interests are open access initiatives, publishing support, digital scholarship, and research data services. And I'm super glad to welcome Amy to the stage.
Thank you, Nico. Bonjour, bonjour. Merci à tous d'être ici. Today's a good day for at least 3 reasons. The first, it's my eldest kiddo turns 8 today. 8. Second, I woke up and there were 2 new Beyonce tracks, one of which with Rhiannon Giddens playing banjo on it. And third, we all get to learn a lot more from open science experts like Nico and Kelly. As this series has made abundantly clear, academic assessment is ripe for reform. How can the adoption of open science and open scholarship principles and practices help with that reform? Both the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, which Kelly knows lots about, and the Coalition of Advancing Research Assessment promote more responsible and meaningful approaches to research assessment by looking at new ways to recognize and reward participation in the research world. What could that mean for open scholarship? And what possibilities does that offer us here at Concordia? Knowing that the Government of Canada's roadmap for open science envisions a complete transition to an open by design and by default model by 2025, and with the goal of rethinking research assessment and open scholarship, Concordia has already taken a decisive step and held the Open Science at Concordia conference in May 2022. This conference led to the creation of Concordia's Open Science Working Group, which Nico had already mentioned, who drafted a fantastic report on the real and active steps we can take towards open scholarship. And if you're looking for that report, it's in our institutional repository, Spectrum. Arriving to this job in this past fall and finding literally on my desk this working group report was a wonderful welcome to this institution. The timing was perfect. Not only does this report recommend reforming a number of tenure and promotion processes to recognize the value of open scholarship practices, it also takes a holistic view of the university, seeing that the evolution towards more open ways of research will require participation and investment from more than just one faculty. This is something for us all to work toward. Libraries have long been the home of open practices. Our goal is to give creators the widest possible audience for their work, be that scientific, artistic, or the wonderful intersection of these two that we so often see at Concordia. The Concordia University Library offers open scholarship supports and services, from the more traditional repositories for publications and data to open licensing advice, open textbook creation, and we are the home to an open access press, Concordia University Press. We were one of the first institutions to get an open access policy through Senate in 2010. And just as heads up, we're going to be looking to evolve that policy to one that includes open scholarship practices in the oh so very near future. We'll be very noisy about it. You'll all get many emails. I'm thrilled that Dr. Kelly Cobey is here, co-chair of DORA, scientist in the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, and associate professor in the School of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Ottawa. I always say, if you work in open access, find some epidemiologists and they'll help you out. She's here to discuss the growing international movement in support of research assessment reform and open scholarship, and how initiatives like DORA provide resources for developing and promoting best practices in the assessment of researchers and scholarly research. And on a personal note, a big thank you to today's discussant, Dr. Nicolás Alessandroni, an FRQSC postdoc in Concordia's Infant Research Lab and co-lead of Concordia's Open Science Working Group, for all the work he and his co-chair, Krista Byers-Heinlein, have done thus far. I'm excited to work together on advancing these recommendations. And now I'll turn it over to Kelly. A big welcome for Kelly, please.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for attending and for this opportunity to speak. I'll just pop up my slides, but I do have to make a confession before I go forward. Not an epidemiologist. So between the affiliation with the Heart Institute and the School of Epidemiology and Public Health, I can't even say it. You know, I'm a fraud. I'm actually a social psychologist by training. So I do wear that lens of medicine, but approach it through social sciences. All right. Okay, so I'll just get started just to begin with some declarations. So as was mentioned, I'm the co-chair of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. That's a role I just started this past fall as well, so it's relatively new to me. But I was previously on the steering committee for about 5 years. And I'm also an ambassador for the Center for Open Science, which produces the Open Science Framework tool, which I may discuss today. Both of these roles are, of course, voluntary and unpaid. Okay, so I'm in a room of people who I suspect know a great deal about open science, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, open science, as I like to define it, is both a movement and a set of practices to conduct research in a more transparent way. It's an umbrella term, so it's many different practices, including open access, open data, open materials, preprints, and so on. There's actually no consensus on what open science is. So as you move from one community to another, the definition may include more or less of the terms you see on this screen. So importantly, to kick off today, I want to say open science is not science. Okay, so I've just told you open science is a movement to make research more transparent and to embed practices that make research more transparent. One would have assumed, I think most of the public would assume, that that would be the cornerstone of research, that transparency and these sort of best practices are what science is all about. But that's not the reality of the scientific system as we stand. So I want to talk about some of the benefits of open science. There's a multitude. I'm going to give you two stories to illustrate two things about open science that for me, make it very obvious that this is something we need to commit to and get done. So on the screen here, you can see a photo of a woman called Jenna Kendall. So Jenna Kendall is and has been for some time a patient at the Ottawa Hospital. Jenna, as a child, was not very athletic, kind of awkward. She just, her parents thought, Jenna's never going to make the NBA draft. Probably will steer her more towards piano lessons than soccer lessons and so on. So it was a bit of sort of a joke in her family. But as she got a little bit older in her tween years, her GP actually thought, there might be something here. There might be something a little more than a lack of coordination going on with Jenna. And maybe we should do some tests because she's not sort of growing out of this sort of awkward phase of her sort of sportiness. Well, unfortunately for Jenna, after seeing her doctor, she ended up getting a diagnosis of limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So that was devastating, as you can imagine, for her and her family, a young girl, life ahead of her, and now having to navigate it with that diagnosis. One thing that was always very frustrating for Jenna and her family was that her genetic subtype had never been made clear. So they didn't know what specific genetic subtype she had. So, Jenna pursued her life, living it fully. She got married, had a family, but all during this time, of course, her muscular strength was deteriorating. And so she became a wheelchair user and had many frequent appointments that were involved as part of her diagnosis. And part of Jenna's sort of path as she navigated her diagnosis was actually becoming involved in the patient advocacy space and the disease societies of her community. And she happened to be in a Facebook group for her disease community as well. And one day, someone from the States shared an article in that Facebook group, and it said, "Limb-girdle muscular dystrophy mimics autoimmune disorder." Jenna clicked on it. She read the article, and a lot of what it said resonated with her. She'd never had her genetic subtype pinned down, and here was a possibility that, maybe she didn't actually even have muscular dystrophy. Maybe she had something else, an autoimmune disorder. Armed with her open access publication, she went to her next appointment with her physician at the Ottawa Hospital, and she said, "Listen, we've never found out my genetic subtype. I read this paper. Do you think I could have this? Could this be something that I would resonate with my sort of clinical profile?" And her doctor said, "You know what, Jenna, I really don't think so. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to sort of resonate with me in the same way it does with you, but it's a simple blood test. So to sort of acknowledge and really rule it out, because I know you're coming here with this, I'll do the test." Within 24 hours, the test results were back. Jenna did have an autoimmune disorder. She did not have the muscular dystrophy she'd been diagnosed with decades before. And this has had an enormous impact on her quality of life. There's now treatments that can help support her as she ages. And I just think this is one example. It's a fairly local example of what open access can do. So making research freely and publicly available. We can't underestimate the number of Jennas out there that are going to the scientific literature and using it to help inform their decisions, whether it's medical or otherwise in their everyday life. Okay, so you know what open science is. I've given you one example of how it can support patients and equity in terms of access. I want to turn to a second example, and this one is more personal to me. So you can see a picture here of the academic building at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, which is where I did my PhD. And during my PhD period in the Netherlands, a man called Diederik Stapel, who had spent most of his career at this university, it turned out, he was also a social psychologist like me, it turned out that he had fabricated most of his career. So this was a world-leading social psychologist in a small country where I was studying, and the sort of downfall occurred during my PhD studies of this man. And so what we realized as the reports came out was that Diederik literally just opened an Excel sheet and put in numbers. So the extent to his research misconduct was as extreme as it could possibly get. He fabricated schools that he went to, consent forms. He fabricated all of these things and, for many, many years got away with this. I'm not here to tell you that open science will address every issue of research integrity. But part of me, I think, as an impressionable graduate student, felt that something was highly wrong with the system, that this could progress for decades without anyone questioning anything about this. And I feel that practices like open data, open materials and so on can help thwart this type of behavior as well. There are, of course, many other benefits of open science, but I won't bore you with listing them all today. But I think, this begs the question, clearly, I think open science is important. How are things in Canada? Is Canada leveraging the power of open science? I'm going to give two examples that illustrate how I think Canada has a long way to go to really be leveraging open science effectively. The first pertains to open access publishing. So again, I've talked about this in the context of Jenna's story. So it's the ability to make an article freely accessible, but there's a second component many forget, and that's to make the article free to build upon, for instance, through Creative Commons licenses. Within the Canadian context, we have a current mandate to make all tri-agency funded research publicly available within 12 months. And very excitingly, there's a really active discussion about Canada, the tri-agencies joining Plan S, which is a commitment to immediate open access for all funded research. There's literally consultation this month about this. And so it's clear we're moving in this direction of, wanting all research publicly available that's publicly funded. And it's just a matter of when, not if. So this is all really positive. This is suggesting we have a policy framework in place. But when we actually look at the data in terms of how we're doing, and this is historic data, looking at how we're doing with the sort of 12-month embargo, what we find is that across provinces and territories, we're not doing well. So on average, 44% of articles published between 2015 and 2019 were available in a publicly accessible way. And if you look at the different types of open access, gold open access is the one where there's sort of fee for service, so the article processing charges. We're paying enormous amounts of money to make our work publicly accessible for the community as well. So I think that suggests that we're falling short both on meeting the stated commitment, but also maybe operationalizing the commitment in a way that doesn't make the best sense. We can look more broadly at the international community with regards to open access, and COVID-19 provides a really nice example. So in this study, what they did is they looked at all published articles between January 2015 and December 2019. So sort of a cohort of articles prior to the pandemic, and about 29% were publicly accessible. If you look at non-COVID articles in 2020, about 32% is publicly accessible. Whereas if you look at COVID articles in the same period, 75% approximately are publicly accessible. So we see with the pandemic, basically, there was this very immediate need and recognized international commitment to sort of mobilize around sharing knowledge, which is great. The cynic in me says, okay, what about the other 25% of the COVID-19 articles? And also the non-COVID articles in 2019 and beyond. Don't those things matter? For people like Jenna, people with other issues, whether it's environmental health or capacities beyond health altogether. It's great that the community has mobilized in this way. Wasn't perfectly effective, but also I think, where are we now? How is this impacting how we reform our publishing landscape for medical research and beyond? And I don't think those discussions are sort of progressing at the same rate as that immediate shifted as a result of it was a statement actually put out by the Wellcome Trust in the UK that many funders and publishers signed on to really commit to OA for COVID research. So, we need to, I think, take that momentum and keep going, and I'm not sure that we've done that. The second example about how Canada's doing with open science pertains to trial registration and results reporting. So this is actually work that our team has done. So for those not familiar with registration, so registration is the process of making a standardized protocol available in a designated repository. And it serves multiple functions, but two key functions is that in the clinical trial setting, when you make this record publicly available before you conduct your work, it actually creates this public record that patients or clinicians can actually refer patients to, so people are aware of studies that are ongoing. It can also help to reduce unnecessary reproduction or duplication of research. So sometimes duplication is good, but this allows you to have a sense of what's ongoing presently. Another point that is really important about registration is that after you're done your study, you're with trials mandated to report your results in the same registry. So it's a record of what you set out to do, and then a record of what you actually did and found. And that's critical because in the absence of both of those things, we can't know about publication bias. So that's when articles, someone does a study, but we never know the results, or selective outcome reporting. So trialists, for instance, they might register a study and say, my primary outcome is X and my secondary outcome is Y. And then when we look at their report, what we find is they report only about Y. And so there's no report of X. It's completely missing from the literature. And it's highly problematic in medicine because trials often go into systematic reviews and then form clinical practice guidelines. So if you're biasing what goes in, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out in terms of our clinical practice guideline. So recognizing the value of registration in a trial setting, there's actually very clear mandates and for decades to register and report your trials. So there's TCPS2, WHO, the Declaration of Helsinki, and so on. And I just want to say that I'm using this example for trials, but registration, of course, exists in many disciplines outside of medicine and for other study designs. So for instance, systematic reviews have a strong culture of registration as well. And it's certainly in social sciences, many people, they call it pre-registration rather than registration, but they opt to follow this protocol as well. So what our team did, led by my trainee Mohsen Aliyesh, is they looked at all clinical trials conducted in Canada between 2009 and 2019. And so we used a registry called clinicaltrials.gov, which is actually American infrastructure that our country uses. And there was 6,720 trials that met our criteria as being sort of conducted in Canada or with a Canadian site. And so we looked at what % of trials met the requirements or policy mandates to be registered before the study started, to report their results in the registry after the study was done, and then what % actually published the results in a scholarly journal. And this was of interest because, of course, there's no policy mandate to say you have to publish in a journal, but we often hear from researchers, trialists, they'll say, oh, I don't use the registry because I just publish. So, you know, it's out there in a different format. That's a problem for a number of reasons. One being it's not in a standardized format and it may not be publicly accessible. So we really want them to be using the registry anyway. And then finally, we looked at what % of trials did all three of these practices. So anyone want to guess what % of trials were registered before the trial started in the registry? So this is a mandate for many, many years, decades. I'll put it up there for you, 56%. So roughly half of our trials, which are amongst the most heavily regulated studies of any discipline, actually do this. When we look at what % report their results in the registry, 39%. So that means that the remaining studies have no public record potentially at all. When we look at publication, you know, researchers say, oh, we've published my results, 55%. So we're not doing well here. And this is, as I said, a very strict policy mandate. When we look at trials that do all three of these things, 3%. So many trials, you know, do one, but very few do all three. So this is, I feel like unacceptable, especially when you're thinking of data that is really data that we are, you know, caretakers of for the patient population. It's not our data, right? The patients have given us their data to do something with it. And I don't think we're honoring it very well by these numbers. So I hope so far you can see that I'm very passionate about open science, that there is a number of reasons why we should be implementing open science, and that despite those reasons and others that I haven't mentioned, Canada's falling short. And I would say and preface that, you know, it's not just Canada, other nations are also falling short. But I think that one of the problems in Canada is that we have no national monitoring framework. So we have, as I mentioned, like policies for trials, registration and reporting, policies for open access publishing. But in the absence of monitoring, you know, we can see that nothing gets done or very little gets done. So I actually lead a meta research and open science program at the University of Ottawa and the Hart Institute. These are the members of the lab currently, and we work on a diversity of different topics related to open science and meta research. And I just want to share this because that I know of, there's no comparable group like mine in Canada in the medical space, which I think is really disappointing. The fact that there's not really a culture in Canada for this. If I, as I have been and trained and worked in Europe, if I was in Europe, there'd be multiple different groups analogous to mine within a given country. So I think, you know, the funding for this type of research in Canada, very challenging to get. And that may speak to why people aren't doing this research or doing it on the side of their desk. And I think it's a real shortcoming in our national context. So is Canada leveraging the power of open science? I'm going to say not as well as it could be. I think recognizing the imperative for open science, and we're creating the policies, but it's this implementation gap that we're falling short on. So as I mentioned, there's no monitoring, but the tri-agencies actually, if I pick on them, they have no public record of research outputs. So you can criticize like for what metrics we should use to assess research and researchers, but like they literally don't track anything. So that would be a starting point. There's limited monitoring of open science practices at the funder level more broadly. There's no national coordination for open science implementation. A great example of that, I think, is with the RDM policies that have come out. So we have this new research data management policy from the tri-agencies. Part of that is required institutions to create strategies for RDM, which is great. But again, they've all had to do this in silos. There's been no fostering of sort of community and support for people to integrate together and do this, despite the fact we all exist in a fairly similar ecosystem. We have no national training programs for open science. So if you know about open science, it's probably because you're in a specialist role that somehow relates to open science, or you've learned it on the side of your desk. We know from training programs that we've run in groups that, young trainees eager to implement open science are frequently told by senior academics, like not to prioritize that. It takes too much time, it's not rewarded, and it's not part of the workflow of the team. So we're actually up against that in terms of our implementation. There's really just no culture. And as I mentioned, there's few opportunities for funding or dedicated funding in this country to do work or meta research around open science. I wanted to provide a bit of context in terms of the trials example I gave. So Mohsin's work where we found that, registration and results reporting is suboptimal, to put it politely. What's really interesting about this particular domain is that the tri-agencies, specifically CIHR, actually reaffirmed their commitment by signing a WHO declaration to ensure trials were registered and reported. So they're saying, yeah, we've already committed, but we're really reaffirming because we now really think we should be doing it. And so as of January 1st, 2022, they indicated they will be doing monitoring. So I read this in January 2022, fantastic. This is wonderful news. We are going to get rid of the problem of clinical trial registration and results reporting and not getting done. And then a year later, they produced their report about their monitoring. And what they basically describe is the process that they implemented to see that this process had happened for trials. So what they did is for 154 trials that were funded in 2022, they sent surveys to the researchers who got that funding. And so 82 people, or 53% of the group, responded to those surveys. So we're missing half of the population's sort of responses. They asked them about whether they registered their trial. So they recently got the money and some time had passed, presumably a protocol and ethics could have been done and their trial registered and underway. So half the people wrote back. Of those people, they say in their report it's 57%, but if you actually use the appropriate denominator, which is the number of people that got funded to do a trial, not the number of people that responded to the survey, 31% of trials were registered prospectively. So you can see that even despite the renewed commitment, if we're not monitoring this in a way that's appropriate, it's not going to get done. So they've said that they're continuing to follow up with the other people to get their responses. The study that we did looking at a decade's worth of data on clinical trials, like literally the whole of the country, that was done in a 4-month period with an undergrad, or was a medical student led that work, Mohsin Eliash. So this was not someone with specialized skills and statistics. There's literally a public repository that you can download this data from and produce these results. So, doing it via a survey, I think is not going to be effective. And in terms of implementing beyond this survey, I'm really keen to see sort of how the tri-agencies reflect on this form of monitoring and revise to get us somewhere that is actually going to get this practice in force. Okay, so lots of slogging off of what isn't being done, but I do want to say there is some good news regarding open science. So we have made clearly within this country a very firm policy commitment to open science. We have our roadmap from Dr. Mona Niemer's office from 2020. We've got our action plan. We've got many tri-agency level policies around open science that are coming to the fore. And this is very much in line, and I think trying to keep us in line with the global community. So, the UNESCO open science recommendations, EU policies, multiple national plans. So like France has a national plan as well for open science, and the World Health Organization's policies on open access, and many, many more. So this is a good thing because whether we're doing it or not, we're committed to it. So if we draw a line in the sand, we can make a proposal as institutions, as researchers, as governments, in terms of moving forward, how we're going to get this done. So I wanted to give you an illustration of something that our research team has done that I think is like a nice approach that could be transferable to other domains or other research areas. So this is a study or a project around creating an institutional dashboard to monitor open science practices. So what we envisioned as the goal was a digital tool that automatically tracked open science practices from publications. So for instance, Concordia could have this tool feed in DOIs from publications, and our tool would spit out, whether there was open data, whether it was open access, what type. There's a whole bunch of different potential practices. So that was the vision. So to begin, what we did is we actually brought together the international community. Our dashboard focused on biomedical research, but conceptually would apply to anything. And we brought together 80 participants from 20 researchers across the globe. And we asked them through an iterative Delphi consensus process to determine what should go in this tool. What would this tool ideally report? And we reached consensus on 19 different practices, some that are very specific to open science, and then some that I would consider more broad transparency practices. Such as, for instance, describing author contributions on a paper. It's not open science per se, but it speaks towards sort of transparency. And so our team has now created an open science dashboard that so far is highly valid and reporting 9 of those practices. So it's not all of them, but we wanted a tool that was automatic, so it didn't require any user input. So the idea here is that we had a vision. Before just plowing ahead with our vision, we consulted the community. We actually asked them what they want in this tool, how it should look, what it should report. And now we've built the tool with that information in mind, and we've taken it back to them very recently to do user testing, to say, you told us you wanted X, we produced Y, based on the constraints of the programming. And how can we make what we produce more aligned with what you need as an institution and we need as a community? So I think that you can check out the dashboard. It's in sort of prototype format there. But this sort of, I think, example illustrates what we need to do better in the Canadian landscape. It's not just decide to do something and work towards the vision at the high level. It's really the grassroots level, bringing people in, doing consultation and understanding what the community needs to move forward. Okay, so for me, I've always been passionate about open science and I've seen the value of it. And I wanted to just create this program of research that was about implementing open science because I think it's so important. But inevitably, whenever I've tried to do that, it comes back to the fact that open science and science are not the same thing. And to get people to do open science will require behavior change. And as a social psychologist, I know that that's a lot of work. And that in order to get behavior change, you need to change incentives and motivations. So I think ultimately, whenever I focus on open science, I'm pulled into the research assessment space. Open science takes time, open science costs money. And if we're going to expect our community to do it, even people who are warm to the idea and recognize this sort of moral imperative, they need to be rewarded. They need more than just time and space. They actually need to be incentivized and supported to do this. And before we can reward open science, we actually need to monitor it. So it's not enough to just say, go do this, it's very important. We actually have to have a way of, when we say that, then checking to see how the community is doing and how we need to support them differently to do better. So at this point, I'm going to sort of switch hats and start talking about DORA. So I've talked mostly about the Canadian context for open science, talked about my research program, some of the work that we've done in this space, and how I think Canada's falling short and how, it shouldn't be sort of researchers like myself or like Vincent Lariviere, who was here previously, that in our research programs, we monitor, the Canadian context. This should be embedded within, the policy framework, right? You create a policy and you create a monitoring framework. But at this point, I'm going to shift and talk more from the DORA perspective, and then I'm going to hopefully link my program and the DORA perspective together in the last few slides. So as was mentioned, I'm the co-chair of DORA. If you're not familiar with it, Declaration on Research Assessment. It's 10 years old. It came about in terms of its mission was to advance practical and robust research approaches to improve how research is assessed across all scholarly disciplines and globally. So one thing that I'm really passionate about DORA is how global it is and how it's sort of discipline agnostic. It brings together such an amazing and diverse group of people around the topic of research assessment. So in terms of why DORA exists, well, I think research needs to be assessed and people want to use evidence to do that. So they want to have quantitative evidence for how they're assessing research. But we know that many of the current measures that are in place to assess research are flawed or inappropriate. So basically, people have to assess research, and the way they're doing it is now widely recognized as perhaps not meeting the best practices or not getting us the quality that we're hoping for. And DORA's there to foster better ways to assess research. So we have a number of different objectives. One is to raise awareness about problems with current systems of research assessment. I would say in the Canadian context, certainly in the European context, that goal of raising awareness is pretty far ahead. So I think, you know, in these contexts, people know there's a problem, and now we want to know, like, what do I actually do about that problem to implement towards something better? And that's the second sort of objective, is we seek to help facilitate implementation within the community in order to catalyze change in research assessment. And one of our underlying objectives is to improve equity. So to make sure the right voices and diverse voices are at the table when we shift from the current system to something new, that we've taken sort of appropriate consultation. DORA is perhaps most well known for its declaration on research assessment. So DORA has a declaration that draws attention to problems with journal-based metrics in hiring, promotion, and funding decisions. It actually includes a set of 18 distinct recommendations for different stakeholders, including funders, institutions, publishers, metrics organizations, and even researchers. And I think the value of the declaration is it suggests the community support for the need for change around research assessment. And it's currently been signed by more than 24,000 individuals and organizations, including the tri-agencies, your provincial funder. It's been signed by McGill. It's been signed by University of Calgary. So there is 51 organizations in Canada that have signed on, and that number is growing. So in my role, one thing that's really great is a lot of people in Canada are reaching out to me about sort of how they can become a DORA signatory and what they need to do. So it's very quickly evolving, I think, in our country. So a lot of people, when they think of DORA, they think of the impact factor, because I think issues with the impact factor were one of the impetuses for why DORA was first formed. So many researchers, you know, our whole careers depend on what journal impact factor we publish in and the number of articles that we have. I won't ask you guys because I know there's some like bibliometrician library folks in the audience, but when I asked what is the impact factor to deans, to heads of research offices, frequently, no one can give me an answer. These are people whose own career has been built using the system of impact factor. They're people who implement impact factor as a research metric tool in evaluating people that they're hiring. But people actually don't even know what it is. So for those who are unaware, the impact factor was actually initially created to be used by librarians in order to decide which subscription bundles they should purchase for the library. So, you know, you have finite budgets and you want to know which library bundles you should buy, and impact factor was to sort of guide that decision-making. Obviously, it's been completely co-opted for a different purpose than this original one. It's calculated by dividing the number of citations in a year by the total number of articles published in the 2 previous years. So basically, if you have an impact factor of 1 at a journal, it means that on average, the articles published 1 or 2 years ago have been cited 1 time. However, there's a number of issues with impact factor. One is that the numerator is consistent, so that's the number of citations, but the denominator is heavily gamed. So what you determine an article is changes journal to journal. So for instance, you know, if we've got some editorials that are really highly cited, let's shove them in. But if we have editorials that aren't, we'll leave those out. So the different journals, like they're highly metrified, these metrics. And there's studies showing what journals compute their impact factor to be and what sort of non-biased individuals might compute, and there's this gap. It's also based on a skewed distribution, so often driven by a few papers. So that skewed distribution makes it practically impossible to predict the success of an individual paper. So, you may publish in a journal with a very low impact factor, but your work is actually very impactful and could actually be highly cited and vice versa. In terms of DORA, one big call in terms of better assessment to implement research reform or open science as part of that. For institutions, there's two sort of statements in the declaration, and one is to focus on the merits of specific individual works. So that would be moving away from things like journal impact factor and reliance on just being in a heavily competitive journal in the first place, and towards things like promoting reproducibility, open science, EDI, and so on. So as institutions, there's like these strategic plans, and you read them and they say they value X, Y, and Z. And then you go look at how they assess research, and X, Y, and Z is completely absent from that process. So, if you do have a strategic plan around something, you need to embed that into your evaluation at the individual researcher or work level. And another call that DORA makes as part of the declaration for institutions is that they need to use a wide range of scholarly products in their evaluation. So, for example, we now have this incoming mandate from the tri-agencies. Apparently this time next year, folks, we're going to be depositing all research from tri-agency funded work. I look forward to seeing how that ensues, but that's the goal. At this point, there is no, for example, national infrastructure for restricted access data that would be like PIPA compliant. So I'm not sure how, like, for instance, the medical community will respond, but this is what they're stating. So the policies are strong. It's the implementation gap that suffers. But one thing that will help, I think, in terms of implementation is that if, for instance, we're going to start rewarding things like data deposits, right? And actually creating time and space for people to get trained up, to shift their workflow. There's like the core of what researchers are trained to do. And then there's the periphery, which is really core to the research overall. But from the researcher perspective, the periphery just keeps growing. They're not trained on these things. They're not supported on these things. There's no extra money for these things. So, we definitely need to incentivize them to do them if we're not doing those other things. We obviously should be doing all of those things. Things like patient engagement and Indigenous engagement and knowledge translation more broadly, it's the same thing, right? So we're told these things are important. They seem important to me. But again, when I go out for a tenure and promotion, no one looks at my previous history of patient engagement. And that's something I spend a lot of time doing, something I think adds a lot of value to my work, but is not captured. Okay, so what can Concordia do? In terms of implementing open science and reforming research assessment, I want to draw to the example of the University of Calgary because it's a national one. The University of Calgary has signed DORA. The process of signing DORA can be in many different forms. So some institutions sign DORA without having done anything, and then they make a plan to how they'll actually implement it. So the signature is actually a signal to the community that this change is coming. Other institutions, they actually do a lot of consultation. They sort of make their strategy, and the signature to DORA is almost like icing on the cake at the end. So they're actually already down that process. Either approach is fine. What Calgary has done, which I think is really cool, and from an implementation perspective, I think is really strong, is they had sort of an as-is period where they signed DORA, and then for an as-is period, they just monitored what they did. They got a handle on what type of research assessment they're doing and sort of mapped that out. Following that, they did a gaps analysis, which included consultation to their community. So they have a map of what they're currently doing, and they consult their community about sort of what the problems are with that and where they need to go. From that, they moved to what they're calling the future state. So they developed a strategic plan based on those two things. And then they've launched that strategic plan. So that was just about a year ago. But critically, as part of that launch, there's built-in evaluation. So we're not just going to say, okay, we have this system that doesn't work. Let's do this other thing and never measure it and assume that it's working in the way we want it to. This is going to be an evolution, not a revolution. This will take time. And I think the earlier an institution can jump on board, sign DORA, commit to research reevaluation, the better, because this dialogue will take a lot of time and will be specific to different faculties and different sort of strategies of different institutions. I wanted to give a couple of examples of what research reform might look like in terms of open science, in terms of future thinking at, say, Concordia. So this is an example of Charité University Hospital in Berlin. And they literally now have on their promotion for professorship, their application. You literally have to say how your work contributes to the research field, and specifically to open science, team science, and interactions with stakeholders or knowledge users. So they literally extract that information in a narrative format from their applicants. And they also have a staff member who sits on committee sort of promotion meetings as a neutral party to promote balanced discussion. So when people start veering towards the old system, this person is this neutral party to say, hey, let's focus on what we have here. So part of this is a significant culture change. It involves training of the reviewers, not just changing the system, but making sure that the people that are, evaluators in that new system are upskilled and supported to make sure that they're implementing it effectively. Another example, which I think is great, this is more in terms of implementing the sort of EDI perspective. The University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, when they're interviewing candidates, they actually give them all the questions ahead of time. So if they're having their virtual interview or in person, they'll let them have all the questions. And the idea here is that the interview is then not a screen for whether you happen to be born in a country of the mother language of the people at that institution or other aspects of equity. So it's not, it will promote thoughtful thinking and not, just individuals who process information very quickly. It's something very small that an institution could do. And of course, they need to monitor to see if this is effective over time. I wanted to highlight at DORA, so beyond those examples, if an institution is keen on reevaluating how they assess researchers and supporting open science, we do have a recently launched tool called Reform State that has policies, documents, and examples that you can look at of other institutions that have done this. So the idea is that we shouldn't all have to recreate the wheel, reinvent processes. If there's drafts that are out there, take them, use them if they're applicable, modify them and expand if they're like half applicable. So this is, I think, a great tool, and we look to build this up over time as more institutions take the plunge away from just sort of being aware of problematic research assessment towards actually new systems, right, that require monitoring. We also have on the DORA website a resource library separate from Reform State. And a really cool part of this, for instance, is case studies of institutions. So you can look at a specific institution. For instance, we have funders as well as actual research institutions. And you can see sort of what their process and thought from, we need to reform to actually making change were. And again, use those as examples. So the idea is that we're supporting one another, creating a community of practice in this space. Okay, so in terms of closing off, I think it's clear open science is important. Canada has recognized that. Where we're falling short is in terms of the actual implementation. So moving from policy to practice. In order to do that, I think it will be critical to reevaluate how researchers are assessed, both at the funder level as well as the institutional level. And that in order to do that effectively, my view is that we need sort of community consultation and a sort of grassroots initiative to move us forward. I think even for me, for example, like speaking from the sort of medical perspective, what makes sense for someone who does like genomics research versus someone who uses like epidemiological data versus, as you can imagine in another faculty, say in arts, they're not going to be uniform. So it's not going to be a one size fits all model for research assessment across the university. I suspect we'll be moving more towards more narrative assessment, but at the end of the day, no one has fixed this problem yet. So this is a space ripe for a leader. And that as we move forward, again, critical is evaluation to ensure that the changes we're making actually are having the desired effects. So I'll stop there. And so thank you for your attention. And I look forward to the chat with the next session.
Let's see if the mic is working. Yes, it seems it is. Yes. Kelly,
Hello. Yeah.
thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. A lot of thoughts here and questions I would like to ask. But I guess I will start with something related to the very end of your presentation. You were talking about alternative ways of assessing research, and you mentioned two ways, narratives and providing questions in advance of an interview, right? So about narratives, we have discussed quite a lot here at Concordia because we had one of the workshops related to that, to narratives, right, and how to implement those. Some might worry that narratives are even more biased than traditional metrics like the impact factor. For example, there might be a risk of conflating linguistic skills, how well you write the narrative, with research quality. How would you respond to that, and what is your view on that matter?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Another concern I've heard that's kind of similar. So not just like the writing quality, but even for instance, like for example, use of gendered language. So, you know, you can have these implicit or explicit biases, right? That come to the fore. And I think what I would say is when you're coming up with a narrative CV question, what's really critical is that, you know, there's a lot of thought put into sort of what that question is and what the sort of impetus for asking it in a narrative format would be. But ultimately, it's not just going to be like creating a new form, a new narrative CV. We're going to need to train our community, right? So the evaluators, they're going to actually have a role in understanding some of the biases that may come with narrative CVs. And for instance, what Charité does, having this sort of person, like a staff member, literally support that process. That ideally will be a transition until everyone upskills. But I think that that's something quite likely that we'll need. I think, again, if it comes from the community and the goal of the narrative CV is, you know, perpetuated by the community needs, I think the biases, we have the ability to reduce or minimize them, but they may, of course, still be there to an extent.
Right. I'm wondering, is there a way to standardize the evaluation of narratives? Do you think there's a way of reducing bias?
I think practically there has to be a way, right? So people have to know what to do with all those words on a piece of paper, right? They need to be able to turn them into some sort of rating system. And right now, for example, like I know for me applying to CIHR, they have this new like 2-pager in the project grants. It's your progress report. And so it's like 2 full pages of text that it's like, tell me everything. Like, tell me how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted you. Tell me if you had like, for instance, like a leave for some reason. Tell me, you know, what your research program is and how it's progressed over time. There's like a lot in there, and I don't even know how to structure it. And I don't imagine the reviewers have an easy time going through those, dissecting sort of meaning from what the person has written, and then can appraise them relative to one another. So I think it's critical that the questions be very concise. We're not giving sort of these free-for-alls. So the questions are associated with goals. And that in our review, before sending it out and having people fill it in, we as a committee and as trained assessors have in mind what we're looking for, right?
Right. That makes a lot of sense, actually. What are other options beyond narratives and providing questions in advance that you see as favorable for changing the landscape of evaluation?
So one thing that we could do, for instance, is like things like the Open Science Dashboard. So that's a way of getting quantitative information very quickly about practices. Then maybe they could, you know, get a score for how they're doing on open science and then be able to elaborate on that, right? To put that score in context. So I think we do need to be practical. There needs to be a balance between sort of narrative, which tends to be a little bit more intense to assess, and then these quantitative metrics. We can't simply be in counts, but we do need to, you know, have space for quantitative metrics when they make sense.
Right. Hopefully we can achieve a balance between quantitative and qualitative, right?
Exactly.
And can that dashboard be implemented for laboratories or research teams or individual researchers?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Conceptually, you can feed in any DOIs and it will spit out sort of whatever group you've put in at that level. We've been very conscious in our sort of development of the dashboard. One thing that was really important to us was that we didn't want it to be, you know, Concordia versus this other university. We were not interested in league tables. And frankly, like most institutions, when you put their information in, they're not doing very well, right? So you have to be, I think, a little bit brave in terms of being willing to adopt the dashboard
Yes.
and recognizing it as a step to say, okay, this is how we're doing. It's a cross section in time. We're not excited about that, but we're excited about what can be in, say, 2 years
Yeah.
when we implement educational interventions or supports around a particular practice, right? So again, it will be an evolution, not a revolution. We're not going to get all those practices up to speed in 2 years probably,
Right.
but maybe we can pick off a couple that are institutional priorities
Right.
and move with those. So yeah, I think that the dashboard that we built, there are other dashboards. France has a national dashboard, which is super cool. So they monitor at the national level. That dashboard we built was built with community input from the biomedical community.
Yeah.
So if it was to be expanded, I think we would want appropriate input from the other communities that would
Yeah.
be using it.
Yes.
It was even, for me, it was very fascinating because when we set out to do this consensus around, what should go in here, I thought, well, of course, open access, that's like almost, when many people think of open science, all they think of is open access. So I thought open access will for sure be in there. But it was a very international community. And many of the institutional representatives said, you know what, if open access is in there, it has to include preprints or it has to include green, because for us, certain journals and their article processing fees, they're out of reach. So it became an equity thing. So, from my narrow perspective, I expanded to see how this tool could work for this community broadly, right? So
Right.
something similar would need to be done for individuals or labs and so on.
Right, and I guess for different disciplines, research reform, assessment reform will look differently as well, right? There is no one-size-fits-all approach. I'm thinking about the art or the humanities. Maybe there's a different way of assessing research in those areas, right?
For sure, it could be the metrics that we agreed. We had these sort of 19 metrics.
Yeah.
Maybe they're not as relevant to certain disciplines, and there's still other metrics that would be.
That, and those might be better defined by the community itself, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think that's often what we're missing is this sort of community informed approach in the Canadian landscape, for instance, like to have that consultation, like even for me, as I mentioned, representing, for instance, at my institution, the Faculty of Medicine on our open science working group. Well, it's a tall order, right? Like, firstly, we all just heard I'm a social psychologist, but beyond that, there's like genomics research, there's, cell line research, there's clinical research, preclinical, like it's a lot. So even within a discipline, there's a lot of different sort of subdisciplinary norms to navigate.
Hmm. Both Amy and you mentioned the Canadian roadmap to open science, which is phenomenal that we have it. But how do you assess Canada's progress in relation to not just open science, but also research assessment reform?
Yeah, so I think the roadmap is fantastic. It's great to have a roadmap. However, it focuses primarily on federal agencies. So institutions like Concordia or universities, they're sort of an aside to that roadmap. So we have seen the federal agencies make significant, I think, and rapid action towards openness. I think that, so it needs to be a bit more all-encompassing. And in terms of like research assessment and reevaluation, I really don't think there's much going on in Canada in that space.
Mm-hmm.
There's not really like a community of practice. Again, I think most institutions and individuals are aware. Certainly many researchers are very frustrated by like the demands that are being put on them and the need to do like publish in high impact factor journals or publish a lot. So it's like, you're being asked to do more, sometimes with less resourcing. And, the system is not necessarily supporting the best science or best research more broadly. So I think there is a huge gap in terms of a space for the community to come together nationally to discuss research assessment reform. And I think where reforms are being made, for example, at like the tri-agencies, I'd love there to be, again, I know they do some consultation, but more consultation about how this is done so that it meets the needs of the government and the community alike.
Right. I was thinking about journals because you mentioned journals, right? And I think one of the barriers that prevents researchers from publishing diamond open access journals that do not charge an APC, right, is that they are less prestigious than their gold counterparts, right? So maybe we also need to shift how we evaluate publications in order to allow for that practice to happen. What do you think about that?
Yeah, like I completely agree. I also think like the current system is just unsustainable financially. And so I think, need to, as part of reevaluating our commitment to open science, think about what that means for publications and where they'll best sit and best be disseminated. I think like there's enough money in the system, but we need to sort of reallocate where it's going, and probably putting it towards like, the big five publishing groups is probably not the solution. So that again, it's behavior change, it's culture change, and it will take time. Many of the people in senior leadership positions built their careers in these systems, right? So to then, create reform requires a lot of, I think, visionary thinking and reflection on what makes good research.
What has not allowed for research reform, assessment reform to happen? Because we've been hearing about open science for quite a long time now, but research assessment reform has not really taken place. It is now taking place in other countries and here as well starting. Why do you think that's the case? Are there resistances? Is it the natural process?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I wish I knew the answer outright, but I think a couple of things. So for instance, I gave the example of Diederik Stapel in the Netherlands. That was like a good fraud case that got a big discussion about open science and research reform going. So, sometimes there's like a real catalyst like that can set things in action. I think part of it is that Canada, like while there's discussion of open science, and certainly there are policies coming to the fore in this space, I having lived and trained in Europe for almost a decade, when I returned to Canada, literally it kind of felt like coming back. It was like the Stone Ages for open science. So it was really hard because although we have policies and we've been discussing about it, I think our discussions are a lot more juvenile than they are certainly in the European context. So, Europe has been having these conversations for decades longer and now are ready to act. Canada is just sort of, getting their discussions really going, and I think are playing catch up at the policy level. And that's why there's this gap, because the policies, they're coming and they're coming fast. And I love it. But then, I just wish that the supports and the implementation processes were thought through as well.
Yeah, maybe there are different open sciences, right? So, because in Latin America, there's also been a lot of discussion,
Exactly,
especially with regards to open access, right? And the motivations for implementing open access are really different than those of the European context and North American context. You mentioned DORA. There's always also COARA in Europe. What do you think about all these declarations and organizations, coalitions that come together to promote open science?
Yeah, I think it's great. So DORA and COARA, I think, are very much in alignment with one another. COARA, if you're not familiar with it, for folks in the audience, it is international in scope, but practically it's very European centric, I would say, at this point. And it really looks at, putting pen to paper and committing to DORA-like principles within a time frame, which I think is great. And I certainly think there's definitely room for more than one organization in the research reform space. We've got a lot of work to do. So we look forward to working with them and collaborating and growing the breadth of their organizational representations beyond Europe. So for DORA, one thing that's always been sort of core is the international scope. And it's amazing to have that, but it presents challenges too, right? Because as you've mentioned, in the sort of Latin American context, like the contexts are very different. And then we have disciplines and, there's federal universities and private and public and so on. So there's a lot to consider, but I think together with COARA and other organizations in this space, we're hoping to build a community of practice and support one another, as people lead, to make it a little less cumbersome for those who follow.
Yeah. Being co-chair of DORA must be a great responsibility, right? And you must be working in very exciting projects. Can you tell us about some of those and what are the next steps for DORA?
Yeah, for sure. It's a really great role. And so I am co-chairing with Dr. Ginny Barber, who's at Open Access Australasia. And so she's really wonderful to work with. And the two of us, I think, recognize the need to move from awareness raising, although we still have work to do in some jurisdictions, but we're moving more towards implementation. And, we have a lot of tools to support researchers and research institutions, but we want to do more. And so one idea that I have that I'd like to really pursue in the coming year is creating actually an implementation handbook for institutions such as universities. which would provide a sort of framework for how they ought to move from, recognizing the problem to actually like, what do we actually do? Like, what's the first step? Do we need a working group? Do we need a needs assessment? Do we need a mapping? And so this would by no means be prescriptive, but the idea is that it would provide a framework that they could almost in a handbook format say, okay, we want to do this. How do we actually go about doing it? What are the possible pathways forward? So that's a tool we're looking for feedback on as we look to consider developing it.
That's exciting. We are looking forward to the handbook. We already implemented the space rubric here at
Right.
Concordia to create our report with the Open Science Working Group. So that
Yeah.
sounds like an amazing resource.
Yeah, for sure. And the second tool that I'll mention, which literally should be sort of coming out within the month, is we have a document that is about problemetric metrics. So
Okay.
it's a whole suite of different metrics, defines them like very concisely in terms of what they are and what problem they pose in terms of maybe it's equity or poor quality research or whatever the issue is.
Mhm.
And it's meant to sort of empower sort of advocates when they try to make change and then someone says, oh, well, let's use X. And they can say that doesn't work for this reason. So really to try to help facilitate those people who are in these positions to have the evidence to actually move towards something new.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That sounds like a very much needed resource. We are happy to welcome questions already also from the audience. So if you have one, if you'd like to ask, there is a mic available and you'll be able to post any questions you might have to Kelly.
Just raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you.
Yes. Or comments. Doesn't need to be a question. Yeah, so we have one there.
Hi. I tried. I'm Gilbert Raymond. I'm professor in applied human sciences, trying to do some social research on HIV, vulnerable communities needing attention and money. I don't have to make a long story to tell you that the grants we get in this domain are almost neglectable in the market. But we find some results that are very important for the communities that we deal with. I tried to be open and publish my data or make them accessible, but you would recognize everyone who's spoken. And they are vulnerable, and they are in the condition that we cannot disclose these conditions. I tried to publish, but the problem is not so much important for everyone, so we don't publish that. In fact, we publish if you pay a lot, like 2,500, which is more than 10% of my grants. So can I spend 10% of my grant in publishing, or I go to a Canadian journal that requires people to pay for having a copy of the article? So what is astonishing in that is that we don't address the issue of the capitalism behind that, which is the nerve there. We go around, we try to deal with that. We find a way to balance the weight of these journals that could go elsewhere. And I'm part of that because I do review for these journals. And they ask me to judge articles about communities that are having some difficulties with human rights, but they do as if it was nothing. And I'm in a world where I deal with these human rights and EDI and all these aspects. An article about Black Canadian is not important, but HIV can be important in them. And that's one of the things that I'm publishing around. Indigenous communities don't even think about publishing. Okay, but they are EDI. Important. So my reaction is that it's near an utopia, what you say. And if university don't stand and say, we should address these beats that are from us, that are the publishers, or the capitalism system that is behind this market. We won't get anywhere into this utopia.
Yeah, great. I can have a go. So I think a lot of what you said certainly resonates with me in terms of the challenges of working with these populations that, you know, we say are very important and we prioritize them. There's a lot of sort of EDI commitments to this thing. And then in reality, as you say, you know, that's not the work that gets published at Nature or Science, right? So, you know, you're in a system that tells you we value something, but then evaluates you on a standard that doesn't consider what they themselves say is important, right? So I definitely get it. In terms of your perspective, you know, I was sort of educated further in terms of my international collaborations. You know, you sit here with privilege at Concordia to have funding to do the work at the magnitude you do. You can imagine someone on the global south, for instance, where funding capacities are even more reduced, right? So the inequities are sort of compounded. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's the populations and communities that you're working with. They're already sort of underserved by research. And then, you know, when it is done, it's not giving the sort of space and recognition that it needs. So it's definitely a problem. To your comment about, you know, trying to implement open science, but, you know, struggling in terms of these populations being identifiable. I think I didn't mention in my talk today, but like, for instance, with Indigenous data, there's the OCAP principles that consider data sovereignty. So there are instances where certainly open data is not appropriate, never will be appropriate. So we, these sort of adages like as open as possible, as close as necessary. So that consideration, I think, is really at the individual and study level that one needs to put forward. I think that for me in my capacity in previous roles as well, you know, consulting, people will come to me with very similar stories. You know, I think I do meaningful, high quality research, and it falls out of the scope of sort of what is actually considered as such. And all I can say is I agree. And I think that the problem is not you. The problem is not your research. It's the system that we've created in our institutions. And certainly part of that system is giving money to commercial entities. And we give so much money. I find it almost comical when arguments against open access publishing, people say, oh, it costs too much money, it costs too much money. Like, we are spending a lot of money on open access publishing. It's how we're choosing to spend it that is the problem. As you've mentioned, you know, you submit your work, maybe someone else in the domain reviews it for free. An editor, you know, does the editorial work for free. And then we pay someone to put it on the internet, which is like in this day and age, you know, it's not logical at all that this would cost like large sums of thousands and thousands of dollars. So I think we really need to move away from that model and that prestige factor of doing that towards more like editage, for instance, in Quebec or local institutional ways of sharing. And also, for instance, like even the review process, right? We're doing it for free, but you know, everyone says like, oh, it's in a peer-reviewed journal, this brings it prestige. There's like literally no training for peer review. So for, you know, it makes it seem like it's past some sort of critical benchmark, as now it's like been sealed and approved. But, you know, I know for me, when I started doing peer review is the end of grad school, I used to spend like hours and days trying to do a peer review because I had no idea what I was supposed to be doing. No one had trained me to do that. It's not part of training. And then, you know, over time you figure out sort of how to copy the templates of reviews you've seen, but am I doing a good job? Am I adding value? I don't know. Because, you know, again, we have this sort of assessment that it's like very prestigious, but the whole process of which that prestige is built upon, I think is very strange. And it literally comes from sort of old boy clubs of men making decisions in rooms about what should move forward and what should not. And I think it's just when we reflect upon the system, you can just see you pull a string and the whole thing falls apart. And we need to do that. And it's a big change for our community and for research culture. But I think in order to be cost effective and to enhance quality, we need to do it.
We have another question.
Hi, I'm Olivier Charbonneau, Senior Librarian at Concordia, and I've spent $3 million of Concordia funds to buy back copyrights to the science that could have been open. But that's not my point. I was giving a seminar in a PhD for PhDs in one of our wonderful faculties here that I won't say which one, but I just asked a simple question. I was asked to talk about, research and citation, and everybody thought I was going to present Zotero, but I asked a simple question at the beginning. I asked who is going to do a thesis by article, because that's a very popular way of getting your research portfolio up, but also, and then I just said, make sure you keep your copyrights when you publish so that you can include your articles in your thesis. And that led to 2 seminars, because I've had to come back the following week, and I'm probably gonna have to do a third discussing predatory publishing, APCs, publisher taxes that some people call, all those questions. And understanding the scholarly process, I think the Old Boys Club is actually a quite apt analogy, because the students in the room were like, wow, this is, so we talked also about open science and open access and assessment and altmetrics and all those questions. That was part of the conversation of a thesis by article. And the question was, yes, okay, but the game hasn't changed yet. So how do we still have to play the game to become tenure track faculty to start? And why would I want to play this game? It seems awful, because I want to have an impact on society. I want to change the world with my research. I want to engage with communities. How can I do that? And I'm speaking to your point, to my dear colleague here. And I didn't have an answer. So we talked about looking at the list of the editors of the journal to see if they've published articles recently in that journal and citing those papers so that you basically throw back some. And then somebody in the room said, that's kind of like social media. It is exactly like what's happening on Instagram. These are just influencers, but it's not the truth. And so my question is, and there was an article in The Economist, the popular British magazine last week, about how this system will actually limit the impact universities have on society. If we keep playing this metrics game, universities will become irrelevant because they're going to be self-obsessed about a system that doesn't provide value back. So I just wanted your comment. I mean, you've obviously.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I've not heard the influencer analogy. It's a good one. I think I agree. I think for me, reflecting, I'm an early career researcher. I have a research program. I'm trying to move forward and reflecting on, my vision for DORA and my vision for implementing open science. I'm torn because I feel personally, like so many, I'm in 2 systems. I'm in the system that has persisted for decades, where I still have to publish lots, publish in the right journals with the right impact. But then now there's all these other things that I have to do. So, and that I want to do, that I think are important, right? And so, yeah, I think we're in a difficult period where we're basically navigating 2 systems, and that can't be the answer, right? So we're being asked to do more and more. I think that's a really big problem. I think with respect to sort of the value of institutions and metrics and so on, like, well, it's no sort of secret to anyone here. I'm sure there are significant cutbacks in our education and funding for institutions in Quebec. You guys have been particularly hard hit. And I think that, this is really a time where we as research institutions, we as federal agencies and governments, as well as literally like people, patients and the public, community engagement, we need to reflect on sort of the system that we've built and whether it's meeting our needs. And I think that reflection is so critical and will help to guide us forward through consultation in terms of where we need to go from here, because, it's not working, and the sort of half implementation of, say, open science or these other sort of periphery practices that are coming in, it's really not working. It's creating additional burden. We're being asked to do more with less. We're being asked to do the old system and the new system. And I feel like neither is really getting done, because it turns out we're all human and have finite number of hours in the day.
Hello, Kelly. Thanks for your wonderful presentations. My name is Fei. I'm the research assessment consultant at the University of Calgary, and we have a big team of knowledge impact working on the knowledge engagement, DORA and open science. Thanks for introducing our work. And we are also very excited that we have a chair of DORA from Canada. And my question is, as you introduce and all the trail agencies side DORA, and also they have the open science strategy, but there's very nice monitor. So as the chair of the DORA, do you have any plan on collaborating with trail agency to promote the DORA and the open science in Canada? Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for your question, and glad to see Calgary represented here. I think there's some really great work going on there, and I think Calgary is further ahead than many other institutions in Canada, and they should be proud of that. But I also think they're not that much further ahead. There's still room for other leaders in this space. So I'd encourage folks to connect with Calgary and see sort of how they've done what they've done so far. In terms of being in Canada and being involved in DORA, I think it is exciting. Like, for example, the repository that we host of case studies of institutional research reform, there's no example from Canada. There's not a lot that's been done in the Canadian context. So I think in my role, I'd love to sort of bring attention to research reassessment and reform and implementation of open science. Like nationally, I'd like to bring attention to it, but I'd like to bring Canada to the international stage and be part of these discussions. I'm always happy to speak and to get to know the local Canadian community and sort of their needs. So folks should feel free to reach out to me or my co-chair Ginny, if they have ideas of how we can do that. Of course, DORA's initiative is global in nature, but me specifically being here, I would like to see my role add value to the national context. So I have lots of meetings with various stakeholders at institutions. Tomorrow I have a meeting, for example, with CHR regarding the trial registration and results reporting. So I kind of have the sort of two hats in the sense that I'm running a program around meta research and open science, and now I'm in this sort of international leadership role. So I'm hoping between the focus of my research in the Canadian perspective and the dialogues that I get to be a part of in the international space that, I can add value where possible to the national context.
Hello. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay. I wonder, because you speak a lot of open science and you come sort of from a medical biased perspective here, and we've seen social science that engages with epidemiology related research. I come from computer science and engineering and NSERC strategy. Yeah. And I see that in our fields, there's a conflicting policy, I think, for funding, that industrial affiliations, industrial co-funding is being very, very highly priced. And I see there is a theoretical conflict between the two goals, right? Because industrial research, yes, there's some industrial research that's totally commensurate with open science ideas, but a lot is not. Where the research is in terms of internships, you cannot make the entire internal things of a company public. And sometimes you just don't want to disclose this for the competitive advantage that it gives to the industry. They're not in this just out of altruism. So I wonder, because you have something more institutional, a viewpoint, can this be resolved?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So I think that I guess if you're supported as an individual researcher by your research institution or your funder to pick your partners wisely, you'd be able to pick these partners that are more for open innovation and so on, right? But if at the end of the day, what you're rewarded for is bringing in a partner that brings in lots of money, those things are not necessarily aligned, right? And sometimes certainly we can see partnerships that come with both open innovative thinking as well as funding. And I think that those are the ones I would think as a society we would want to prioritize. But I don't think, as you've pointed out, our current system would permit that, right, in its current form. So I think this will have to be sort of a revolution in terms of our thinking. The Montreal Neurological Institute's TOSI down the street is a great example of having committed to open science and still allowed some flexibility amongst like their researchers to have autonomy to make certain decisions, but really supporting the open innovation route as well. So it will likely be a bit of a hybrid model in that space is what I would see.
Hi, my name is Javier. I'm from the School of Graduate Studies. I basically help implement professional development opportunities for graduate students. And so my question is to you, what sort of skills should we aim to develop in graduate students to help them be better prepared for, for open research? I mean, things like, data preparation or metadata or something like that, but I don't know. From your perspective, what would be the key skills that they would have to develop?
I think that's a really great role and so important in this transition. I think really getting the grad students trained is such an important component of the workflow for the overall projects, because they're often the ones sort of on the ground doing things. So what I would say, I guess, is a couple of things. Firstly, I think the training that you're developing, while obviously is for the graduate students, is probably highly pertinent to even senior scientists. So I've given talks where I'm giving workshops around, say, data management and planning, and it's part of, say, rounds. And I've received comments that are both very insulting, but also complimentary. So I, for example, have had like the head of the department say, I came to your talk today about research data management because I always show face at rounds and I thought it would be quite boring. But actually, it was like the most meaningful rounds I've had all year, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And they had been working with certain workflows their entire career, never really questioning them, and pointing out sort of gaps was very valuable to him. So I think, yeah, the training is probably more broadly relevant. But if I was thinking about developing a training program, say, on open science, I would first start where there are, for anyone, but for trainees, would be around compliance to policies. So start with policies that exist and make sure that we're upskilling people to meet those sort of basic criteria. Because the reality is, like, to be like an innovative open science institute in Canada would be to just comply with policy, like, because no one does that. So that would already be like incredible if your grad students knew that, when they left the institution, these policies existed and how they were relevant to their own research workflows, whatever area they're in. That's what I would suggest. And I think more broadly, I don't know how like your role and your sort of office is sort of embedded, but I think it should be mandatory. I think training around like research best practices, be it like research integrity, open science, and so on. I think it really needs to be mandatory. It's a skill that you should not leave your certainly graduate training without having, right? So I think for me, one skill in particular, just because it's practically, I think there's a lot of behavior change and learning that needs to occur, is really the RDM. So research data management right now, like there are, like it's the Wild West. Like when you join a research team as a trainee, the average trainee, I know this because I've surveyed at multiple institutions in Canada, there's no like onboarding regarding research data management. It's often just like let to the individual to like assume that they know what they're doing and their files are kept, right? So there needs to actually be like standard operating procedures at the institution or the faculty or and even the lab level that people are following. So training just the trainees won't be enough to really make that transition, right? We need to have the PIs on board as well and supported in implementing those types of changes.
So Kelly, we need to wrap up a little bit. So I would like to ask you a very concrete question, which is, what are some practical steps that institutions can take to get started with transitioning to a new way of academic assessment?
Yeah, great. So I think a very practical thing would be to sign DORA or COAR or similar initiatives. For me, this is a signal to your community that, this is something you're going to do. Ideally, that signature would come with a strategy that you're going to implement. That doesn't need to be an institutional strategy. It could be a strategy to get to an institutional strategy. Yes. But it needs, I think it would serve as a signal to the community that, you're taking this seriously and that you're going to move through this sort of evolution. And I think, again, the consultation. So really embedding in consultation. We all know what currently is existing for research assessment doesn't work. But what we need to do is move to something better and recognize the iterative nature of that, and the need for ongoing communication, I think, is so key with the stakeholders.
Well, Kelly, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking
Thank
Kelly
you.
Cobey for the great presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And before closing the event, I would like to invite Holly Nazar to provide some closing remarks. Holly.
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to quite briefly thank all our speakers, Amy Buckland, Monica Renan, Nicolás Alessandroni, and especially Kelly Cobey for coming here from Ottawa today to present to us. And I was going to say, please stay tuned for the next final 2 events in our series. You should see some information in the Concordia newsletter or hopefully emails about the events. And you're welcome also to stay until about 2:30 to finish the coffee and the snacks that we have and do some networking. So thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, thanks for everyone for coming in today's conversation. Everyone online, just let you know, we'll be closing up the live stream and the Zoom now, but reminder that this is already available on our YouTube channel, so feel free to revisit this. That's all. Please join us for the next event. Have a good afternoon.